I love Jesus. I am 100% on board with Jesus' understanding of God within. I also love that he urges us to be predisposed toward helping the poor and needy, and he insists that our social infrastructures, our governments, should primarily focus on keeping citizens healthy, educated, and fed. Jesus wants people to do all these things out of kindness, which he believes is our default operating state. But he also knows that when people get together and form things like governments and religions are less attractive aspects, greed, power lust, just plain lust, they often suffocate the kindness within. When Jesus talks about the kingdom of heaven, I understand him to mean a civilization built on kindness, love, and self-sacrificial support for the communal good, something we create here and now. For Jesus, having the will to serve, the desire to give our stuff and ourselves away, is fundamental to creating the realm of God. We can't be forced to be kind. Forced sacrifice builds resentment. People must experience God's kindness welling up within, increasing pressure until God bursts forth from us in unconditional acts of systemic resistance and spectacularly daring charity. For example, suppose I have 2 goats and my neighbor has none. Some political systems would force me to give a goat to my neighbor, or perhaps the system itself would confiscate both my goats to redistribute to others. But here's the thing, maybe my neighbor doesn't have a goat because he's terrible with animals. Instead of grand gestures, instead of forced redistribution of wealth, Jesus says, change the world by acting kindly toward your neighbor who is actually really bad with animals. But they have other talents. And even those without any talent still deserve to eat and sleep inside. Your neighbors deserve to be, and you need them to be, healthy. Take care of your neighbor. Love them, in fact, like they're your family. Do this of your own free will, and the rewards will be tremendous, Jesus says. I love Jesus because his rules are simple. Don't hoard. Make sure everyone has enough. Love like everyone is family. To riff on last week's Ubuntu theme, why do some of us get 3 shots while others get none? Jesus preaches the necessity of an equitable footing from which all human beings can blossom and transform from the raw roots that we are and act like into a color burst of sweet-smelling justice for all in a world where all truly means all. Jesus begs us to serve the common good, to give everything we are, our entire lives, in fact, for the sake of God's tremendous and universal love. Jesus is a public servant in the truest sense of the word. And he wants us all to be public servants too. Not for money, not for power, and certainly not for our own glory, but merely from kindness, unforced, pure, from our soul's covenantal understanding of life with God in and through each other. I love Jesus for believing in a God of universal love, not condemnation. Because that's what love is. Unconditionally and eternally forgiving. I believe in that God too. God's loving kindness, chesed, effortlessly pours through Jesus because it's who Jesus is. He urges his students to become the same, vessels for God's chesed. We are all to find our God center, our inner Christ-like, Buddha-like, Mosaic nature, and let God's love flow through us as we love, accept, and serve one another unconditionally. More than anything or anyone else, I think Jesus identifies with the servant. Certainly not with kings, not with gods either, but servants. I think part of the reason the Bible recounts Jesus' reading in the temple as a passage from Isaiah is because he deeply identified with the prophet. In Isaiah chapter 52, verses 13 through 15, he writes, "Look, my servant will succeed. He'll be exalted and lifted very high. Just as many were appalled by you, he too appeared disfigured, inhuman, his appearance unlike that of mortals. But he will astonish many nations. Kings will be silenced because of him, because they will see what they haven't seen before. What they haven't heard before, they will ponder." Some generation after ours, Isaiah says, will right the world because they finally understand the importance of being a community of servants instead of warlords. Isaiah, like Jesus, is all about telling the power brokers that the very people whose rights and living conditions they're demolishing are the same people who are favored by God. People who will ultimately do amazing things, who will succeed in their quest for equity because, unlike the hoarding power elite, kings in name or fact, the servants understand the importance of the common good. Jesus sees himself as this humble servant of God. Now, Isaiah is not talking about Jesus in this or in any passage for that matter, but Jesus clearly identifies with Isaiah's description of the world. Jesus is appalled by the Romans and the Jewish priests alike because they're both mistreating people. But those regular folks, they don't seem to like Jesus' rabble-rousing either because contrary to their beliefs, his followers claim Jesus is the Son of God, Messiah, inhuman, even though he looks like the rest of us. Well, I love Jesus because he's a rabble-rouser, and I am rabble. Jesus does what he does because it is every human being's right and honor to serve. Jesus doesn't want to be considered extraordinary for this. He leads by example and shows us all how ordinary we might consider what we now deem extraordinary. I mean, making sure my neighbor is cared for should not be an unusual act of kindness. It should be our standard operating procedure. We act best when we imitate Jesus, overflowing with God's grace, freely giving our time and talent to those most in need. We urgently need to awaken to the humble servant within and become providers for the common good, grateful and willing public servants in the truest sense of the word, just like Jesus, whom I love. Amen. Our discussion topic today is, where do you see God's humble public servants? Where in the world do you see God's humble public servants? Let's go into breakout rooms for about 10 minutes to discuss in small groups, and then we'll get back together so that we can share our thoughts with the entire group and learn from each other. If somebody in the rooms would please take some notes so that we can remember some of the concepts we talked about, I'd appreciate that a lot. See you all in 10 minutes, folks. Enjoy your conversations.